Hello. Hello and welcome to this Google Hangout that has been organized and hosted by Representative Anna Eshoo of the district, her district in California. And she's the ranking member of the Communications and Telecommunications Subcommittee, and she thought that she would bring together a panel of experts to discuss a very hot button issue right now in Washington called net neutrality. And this has become a big issue because the Federal Communications Commission has up for vote on May 15th, very soon, a proposal on new rules for internet access. So the new rules for access to the internet. And with us joined today are, again, Anna Eshoo, the Congresswoman from California. She's the ranking member of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee. Her district is in the heart of Silicon Valley, and she's been a consistent proponent of net neutrality. She spent 2 decades in Congress, and much of that time is spent on the Subcommittee for Telecommunications and Commerce. And in that time, she's done many things related to the technology and telecommunications industry, especially her support of public safety telecommunications issues. Robert McDowell is also joining us. He is a former commissioner of the FCC. He served between June 1st, 2006 and May 17, 2013. He's been through net neutrality before. He strongly has warned against regulations that could encumber the broadband internet industry, and if I remember correctly, you dissented on the 2010 vote. So again, this is a story that's been around for a while, net neutrality, and there's been at least a couple of votes through the regulations through the FCC. Matthew Prince also joins us. He is the CEO and co-founder of CloudFlare. CloudFlare is a content delivery network and distributed domain name service marketed as improving website performance and speed, and provides security as well. He has many clients, including Metallica, I just learned, and news sites, and he has also been a strong proponent of federal oversight of internet access and rules, though he has a particularly unique take on that, being a content delivery network. And finally, we have Barbara Van Schewick. She is the professor of law and electrical engineering and the director for the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. She's been also a longtime advocate of network neutrality, and many of her papers are actually been the foundation of a lot of FCC thought on this subject. I'd like to start off with the Congresswoman, who may have to leave us at some point for a vote, not because she doesn't want to leave the subject matter, but so we're trying to get some good questions into you, Congresswoman, to start off with. And if you can just do a brief introduction, but I would just like to ask you first off, from what you've heard of what the FCC is proposing, what is your reaction?
Well, first I want to thank everyone for participating in this. And I don't know if you could hear the noise in the background, but they were bells ringing, so I'm being called for a vote. But I'll run over in my high heels in about maybe 11 minutes, so I can remain with you. There has been, this has been like a prairie fire in terms of telephone calls, emails, communication from constituents. I have 2 grown children. They keep me on my toes. They don't live nearby, but one in the middle of the night, one early in the morning, texted me and said, one said, "What are you doing to the internet?" And the other one said, "What the hell is going on with the internet?" So I think that it's like holding a mirror up to what's going on. There's great concern, not only amongst young people, but amongst, I would say right across my congressional district, and I think across the country. And why is that so? I think that anyone that has used the internet understands what an open, accessible internet is. And you know, Netflix's CEO, Reed Hastings, said, "What is the FCC thinking?" I think that's a very good question. So what has been put out by the chairman and the high level of discomfort, moving right up to total opposition, is the following: that somehow the internet will be balkanized, and that consumers will end up picking up the tab for faster lanes, and others will have to put up with slower lanes. And what does this mean to innovation and startup companies who cannot really come up with the money that the large companies can come up with? So it's consumers, it's an innovation platform, it's affordability, and it is what is the internet really going to look like, and how is it going to operate fairly for people? And I think that those are all fair questions. Now, I noticed today that Commissioner Rosenworcel, the FCC, suggested that there be a delay in the vote because there are literally hundreds of thousands of people that have weighed in on this across the country. I think she has a very good point. The chairman had a vote scheduled on the proposal for May 15th. That's in a handful of days. So unless all of the commissioners can really absorb the comments that people are either emailing in or registering over the phone, I think that she has a very good point that it should be postponed so that each commissioner is fully apprised of what people across the country are thinking and saying and why they're so concerned. I think there's reason to be concerned.
You know, Congresswoman, when we talk about the confusion and what is really the big question, when you quote Netflix's CEO saying, what is the FCC thinking, it might be good to just, for the people in the Hangout, to just sort of rewind and explain, this is the language that I think is the most troubling or confusing for people. When the FCC says, broadband providers would be required to offer a baseline level of service to their subscribers, along with the ability to enter into individual negotiations with content providers. In all instances, broadband providers would need to act in a commercially reasonable, those are two sort of trigger words, manner, subject to review on a case-by-case basis. When you hear that, Congresswoman, what is your response to that? Do you think that that makes sense in practicality, that can actually be achieved?
Well, I have 750,000 constituents, and I think of caseload and how you are going to be consistent relative to that term, which is open to broad interpretation. I think there's room for a great deal of mischief in this because if you are not absolutely consistent when it comes to the reasonable, the commercially reasonable phrase, then there will be a plethora of lawsuits. Party A will say that Party B was treated differently than Party C. And so it sounds tidy, but I don't think it's going to work that way. And in my view, there isn't any. I have very little doubt that this is going to that this will open the door to content providers, the ISPs, being able to control a great deal. And when you have that, I think that it really reshapes the internet as we know it and as we have experienced it. And that's what's very troubling to me. I think the core principle relative to net neutrality is that that all internet traffic should be treated equally. So that's the question. Pose that as a question. Will all internet traffic be treated equally? Or is it going to move to another ground, another plane? And if so, what is that? What is commercially reasonable? And and when you have huge questions like that, they need to be addressed. I think that's why people are all of a sudden feel like they're standing on very, very shaky ground.
Congresswoman, a few, and I'm just going to focus on you before you have to go. 100 or more companies, many in your district, today sent a letter to the chairman of the FCC, Tom Wheeler, expressing their concern about what they've heard of the proposal. And I'll just read one line from the saying, according to recent news reports, the Commission intends to propose rules that would enable phone and cable internet providers to discriminate both technically and financially against internet companies and to impose new tolls on them. If these reports are correct, this represents a grave threat to the internet. So, and they say specifically that paid prioritization would be bad, that's what they're fearing. What would you say, so you've been through this before as well, with the former commissioner as well, Robert McDowell. You've seen rules in 2010 be passed and proposed, passed and then overturned by court in January. What do you think is the best course for the country in terms of internet access, and if there should be any rules at the FCC or in Congress? What do you think is the most ideal scenario for the public and consumers?
Well, it's the $64,000 question, how to thread the needle legally, and we have an outstanding professor of law from Stanford that I think will certainly weigh in on this, but the court has rejected some parts of the decision that the FCC took. So what is the best way to accomplish it? I don't think what's being proposed is, and I think you have a sense of why I don't think that is workable or likable. I think that the whole area of reclassifying broadband services under Title II of the Telecommunications Act or as a common carrier should be examined. That's something that I think that the FCC should take up, examine, pull it apart, put it back together, and see what they can come up with that. But I think that it's worth the thorough review. I think that Mozilla has a hybrid proposal of reclassifying Title II. That's something else that the Commission can take up. But there are two elements in this that stand out to me. Consumers, what they have, how they have come to understand the internet, what it represents to people, not only across our country, but around the world, and innovation. It has always been a platform for innovation. So if you have large online companies that can afford arrangements with internet service providers for faster connection speeds, that's terrific for them, and I don't blame them for wanting that. They can make a lot of money on that. Who is going to pick up the tab for that? Doesn't the consumer usually end up picking up the tab for that? And then what happens to all of those small startup companies, several of which I just visited with during the Easter recess, where they have 2, 7, 11, 21, 59 people in a startup? They don't have a team of lawyers or lobbyists here, and I don't think they should have to have them in order to make it. They want to compete. They want a level playing field, and I'm worried about the innovation that keeps coming from a small and newly born ideas, not only in my district but across the American landscape.
Do you think that there's sufficient support for a re-examination? And you're not saying to go for Title II, but you're saying at least re-examining that on the Hill. There's political wins, in other words. And can you talk a little bit about that? What you think is the FCC is up against from where you're sitting?
Well, I think that there are many times that I have felt quite lonely holding my net neutrality blanket in my lap. I mean, this is not something that, truth be known, on the Republican side, they view net neutrality not as a neutral or core operating principle that all internet traffic, be treated equally. They view it as an intervention of government. I don't know how they ever got there, but that's what they think, and they are very sincere about it. And so there's fierce opposition to the FCC doing anything. They just want it left alone. for anyone to do whatever they want, I might add, because that's really what the position is. And there are great net neutrality supporters on my side of the aisle, but that doesn't mean that every Democrat either understands this or holds the view that I do. So I wouldn't think that the Hill is exactly the place for great internet policy right now. And I say that reluctantly, but that's the way I see it, and it's a landscape that I've been a part of for quite a while. So.
Are you getting tugged? Because I'd like to ask you one more question, if I could.
Go ahead, because there are still many, even though there are only a few minutes left on the clock for voting, most members have not voted. So I'm going to take advantage of that. And,
terrific.
Go ahead.
Fantastic. Well, we can't talk about the internet broadband economy without talking about competition. And this is all sort of tied and related to net neutrality. And several people who submitted questions address that, the issue of competition. And we have right now a big merger that's being considered in Washington, Comcast merger with Time Warner Cable. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on competition in the market, what that means for consumers as they think about internet access and getting things with the kind of quality and speed that they deserve and the prices, and how this merger perhaps fits in the landscape of that?
Let me put this through the lens of my constituents and what they have said to me, which is not a surprise, but I still want to share it with you. There is, I think, close to a near revolt on the part of consumers in terms of the prices that they pay for not only their monthly bill, for their internet service, for their cable, and some have obviously telephone service included. They don't believe that there is competition, and so the prices keep going up. They don't think that the service is terrific when they need it. And they are very concerned in their communications to me. What they've expressed to me about the proposed merger is that larger is going to put a squeeze on them and that their bills will become larger. They don't like that. And so I haven't had one constituent, honestly, and I've heard from a lot of people, I haven't had one constituent call, write, email, fax, stop me in the grocery store, you name it, and say, I'm for it. And that expression that's really something. That says a lot to me.
Do you
I'm
have
not surprised, but I would have thought that there would have been a mix of opinion. There isn't. It's totally one-sided. They are opposed to it. They don't like it. They don't see how they will benefit.
So do you have a position, Congresswoman, yet on the merger?
Well, I mean, I've said from the beginning that both the DOJ, Department of Justice, and the FCC have to scrub this very, very carefully. I mean, on the telecommunications side, we have a duopoly in our country. I don't know what's happening to competition in our country. Do we have real competition? I think in more and more markets, we don't. True competition. I'm not just saying whatever the people that are in the market want to do. I'm saying true competition, because when you have true competition, you don't need as much regulation, you see, and something that the chairman of the FCC says on a regular basis. But I worry. I worry about the lack of true competition in our country and what that means for consumers, what it means for innovation, and is anyone else going to be able to get their foot in the door? Because if the big guys see competition from 5,000 miles away and they have the power to squash these little companies like bugs. So, you know, I mean, if that's what the landscape is going to be in our country, I don't think it's healthy.
Great. Finally, your company, the companies that are in your district, do not have the sort of regulatory oversight, obviously, that ISPs or, well, telecom companies have. And one person submitted the question, Rosalind Layton, basically saying that maybe more people in the value chain, more companies, not just the cable and telco providers, but content application providers, they could be discriminators as well. Do you think that there should be an examination of rules across what she described as the value chain of the internet, the edge providers?
Well, I think it's an interesting proposal, but I think that what we have at hand right now is what has to be dealt with, because you're not going to end up with that chain or any of those innovative thoughts unless we get this thing straightened out with the FCC. And I really don't know how the FCC can absorb everything that has washed over the agency in just a handful of days without some kind of delay. Because if I were an FCC commissioner and all of this had landed on my desk, it'd be next to impossible to review everything that's come in. So I think that Commissioner Rosenworcel is on target for saying that it should be that date should be postponed, so that you can really have a broad view lens and a really vigorous discussion of everything that needs to be put on the table. I think that we'll all be better off. And with that I am one of 73 members that hasn't voted, so I think I have to get over to the Capitol because I have. It'll take me at least 7 or 8 minutes to get there. I want to thank you all for participating in this, and to everyone that is sending questions in and listening and or watching. I thank you, and you're now going to be in really able hands because we've got brilliant panelist guests that are with us, and I salute all of you. And let's hope that we get this right in our country. It's one of the imprimaturs of our nation, the internet, and I think you know where I am on it. So thank you, everybody, very much. I'm going to go and vote. I know you'll get upset if I don't. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. All right, folks, so everybody who's on, that was Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, as you know, and she was the ranking member of the Communications and Telecommunications and Technology Subcommittee in the House, and she has gone to vote. So I am now here joined still by a very esteemed panel, including former FCC Commissioner Rob McDowell, Matthew Prince, the CEO of CloudFlare, and Barbara Van Schewick. Schewick, is that right, Barbara?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you. She's a professor of law at Stanford Law School and also the director for the Center of Internet and Society. So we heard a lot from the Congresswoman, and I'm just kind of trying to shake it up. I'm sure there's a lot you'd all like to respond to, and I'll start with you, Commissioner McDowell. Anything that you want to pick from the many questions that we talked to the Congresswoman about, or can I just ask you generally? What do you think of the rules? It seems like nobody actually on either side is kind of loving what's been proposed, or at least reported to be proposed so far. What is your take on that, and anything else you want to respond to from what the Congresswoman said?
Jordan, first of all, many thanks to Congresswoman Eshoo for inviting me to participate today. Hopefully I'm not Daniel in the lion's den here, trying to put forth maybe a contrasting point of view on some of this. But I want to make a shameless plug up front, which is on May 21st at 9 a.m. here at the Hudson Institute, its Center for Economics of the Internet. We will have the Congresswoman back to talk about a lot of these issues and more. So I want everyone to go to hudson.org and tune in 9 a.m. on May 21st. So you're hearing it here first on this Google Hangout. And I think at the outset I should say that, look, I think all of us are for an open and freedom-enhancing Internet, and it's a matter of the path to take there and what's best to get there, and what will have the least amount of unintended consequences. It's also important for folks to understand exactly what Chairman Wheeler is doing right now. So on May 15th, it's a notice of proposed rulemaking. In other words, there are proposed rules. And there should probably be a wide variety of proposals in the wake of the January court decision, which struck down a lot of the substance of what the FCC did in December of 2010, but also breathed life for the first time into a previously untested section of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, something called Section 706. And I don't want to lose viewers by getting too deep in the weeds of legal jargon, but it created an interesting legal debate as to how much authority now the FCC has in the internet space generally. So, for instance, does the FCC have the authority to regulate edge providers like content and application and search providers if it can link that regulation to the deployment and or maybe adoption of broadband networks? So the chairman is putting these ideas forth, and we've seen his blog post, but we actually haven't seen what the notice of proposed rulemaking says yet, and won't until after it's voted on by the commission, whether that's May 15th or later, as Commissioner Rosenworcel has stated. So I have no special information. I'm not allowed to talk to the FCC for at least another year, and I'm here at a think tank and not representing the interests of any of the parties. But
well, so go ahead.
No, so I think it's important for people to know that there aren't rules coming out May 15th. It's a chance for the public to comment on whatever the proposals are. Then the FCC can look at those and ask for further comment if they want, or do nothing, or do something else. Or so this isn't the end of the process. It's sort of the latest iteration of the beginning of the process in the wake of the court decision in January. But go ahead, Cecilia.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, pose the same question I did to the Congresswoman, which is, when you hear this idea of commercially reasonable paid prioritization and enforced and overseen on a case-by-case basis, having sat within the FCC, having dealt with enforcement, with dealing with these issues, does that seem like something that's I'm going to use the word reasonable, but does that seem actually like practical? Is that something that can be done?
Well, a lot of that language comes from the court, which also took the language from something called the data roaming order of a couple of years ago and a court decision there. So Judge Tatel authored that decision in the data roaming appeal and also here in the net neutrality appeal in January. So he likes that, apparently, that sort of looser construct that's actually very close to Federal Trade Commission law. And I think it's important for folks to understand that the edge of the internet, the content in the apps, has blossomed beautifully in the absence of net neutrality rules. But he is looking for something that falls short of more onerous, what we call common carriage rules, something akin to what we refer to as Title II, but the rules that were invented for the Ma Bell telephone monopoly back in 1934, which just, as a matter of engineering, operated much differently from the networks of today. So he was looking for that commercially reasonable arrangement. But it is important for folks to understand that even under Title II, which is not a guarantee on appeal if the FCC could survive that the so-called two-sided market would be allowed. That's allowed under common carriage, as is tiered pricing. So that's not a cure-all. What is the cure-all is looking at whether there are concentrations of market power, abuses of that market power that result in consumer harm. And that is could be remedied by the Federal Trade Commission, as it is in any other aspect of the economy, and not as after-the-fact litigation, but these are before-the-fact, what we call ex-ante rules. You're not allowed to do that. So pretty much all of the potential horror stories that are being offered could be addressed under existing law, that and a whole lot of other federal and state laws, by the way. So I think that's very important for people to understand. That's why we've had the robust internet ecosystem that's developed over the past few years.
That's interesting. Matthew Prince, CEO of CloudFlare. You recently did a Reddit Ask Me Anything, I was just reading, and you talked about how this is a very important issue for net neutrality for your company, a content delivery network. You said that you even retained a DC lobbying firm recently as part of your advocacy of net neutrality, and you hired your first in-house counsel out of Google and the FCC, and you said, quote, "It's hard to overstate the benefits of an uncensored open internet that is has created for the world. We're strong proponents of preserving the principles of network neutrality and have allowed open innovation. If governments around the world start to chip away at those principles, I'm hopeful that CloudFlare can use our scale and size in the market in order to ensure our consumers will still be as fast as possible around the world." So explain to me, why is this an issue for a CDN? Why do you support this, Matthew, and the idea of net neutrality, and your concern, if any, of what you've seen so far in the FCC proposal?
So we were one of the 100 companies that submitted a letter today expressing that there is concern in this area. And I think at core, what I think everyone wants to do is make sure that we don't kill the golden goose. And the internet has been a just magical source of increases in productivity, skill, creativity around the world. And the concern is that as you have concentrations of power in end networks, that they may be able to abuse that source of power in order to discriminate against one content provider or another. The reason we care is that we represent our customers that are over 2 million content providers, some of which are very large websites and can and probably could on their own negotiate with end content providers, but some of which are very small websites, our startups, our individual blogs. And I think that a lot of the focus has been in the fights over what's going on with Netflix versus Comcast. Frankly, I think that's actually almost the least important part of this. These are two extremely large companies. They both have market power in each direction. We've seen history in other parts of the cable industry where important content providers are actually able to exert their power over even Comcast of the world. Think of an ESPN, which gets something like $7 of every subscription when they exist. On the other hand, what I worry about is smaller providers, the new startups, so not the Googles of the world, but the DuckDuckGos, the people who are actually doing new and innovative work. What worries me is that if you start to allow the incumbents to pull the ladders up behind them and make it more difficult to start new and interesting products or services online, then the challenge is that the thing which the internet has been the most of, which is a source of great, new, innovative, disruptive innovation, that becomes harder. And so that's what I'm worried about. And it's I think that if there's a role for government here, it is in trying to figure out how you can preserve this engine of innovation that is the internet, and not allow the incumbents that have already gained sufficient mass to block new entrants and new competitors.
Well, one thing, Matthew, that some people have pointed out, that maybe there needs to also be oversight of your neck of the woods, the peering arrangements, and what's going on in the backbone. What do you think of that? The FCC chairman has actually said that not in this order would he consider peering as part of this of his proposal for open internet rules, but he would generally look at the issue more. What are your thoughts on peering and how this fits into the picture of this debate?
Well, I'd love the government to tell every ISP that they have to peer with CloudFlare and we don't have to pay for bandwidth anymore. But at the end of the day, if you've ever stepped foot inside of a data center or anywhere that the internet really is built, there's real cost which is associated with this. And so you think of Comcast and Netflix, for example. There's an expression in the law that says that hard cases make bad law. Netflix is a really hard case, and the reason why it's a hard case is because at the peak of capacity, they're responsible for about 30% of all U.S. internet traffic. That's an inconceivable amount of traffic. The entire U.S. internet backbone has about 35 terabits of capacity, and again, they're responsible for about 30% of it. To just make the numbers round, imagine that this means that they have 10 terabits of capacity, and you have a provider like Comcast that maybe we'll argue has 50% of the market. That means that at peak capacity, Netflix is delivering 5 terabits of capacity to their network. Just the router costs of trying to support that means that you have to turn up, probably like 1,500 new ports. Each of those ports costs, as much as $10,000. So there's a real cost to actually just even doing the peering. And the fundamental question is who should bear that cost. I think a lot of the challenges around network neutrality would go away with one very simple change. It would be incredibly unpopular, but in the short term, but it probably fixes a lot of this issue. A lot of the problem of network neutrality is happening because of the fact that the markets for end user bandwidth have developed as all-you-can-eat models. So you pay a flat fee and then you can use as much as you want. If we switched to actually a pay-per-usage model, which again, I'm not in favor of as a personal consumer, I think it would be wildly unpopular, but you would watch every single ISP in the world immediately get behind network neutrality because they would say, well, this is great. Now we can, if somebody's using Netflix, we can charge them more, and if they're not using Netflix, we can charge them less, and we can actually pass the consumer the costs on to the people who are actually using the resource. Because of the fact.
Say one very quick thing. The Open Internet rules allowed exactly that.
That's
so
right.
There is no need to change anything. Operators could just do it.
I think that's exactly right. I don't think that there's anything that keeps that from happening. I'm not sure. It's not a regulatory issue. The issue is just the dynamics of how the market has moved, and actually the fact that you have no one that's doing that. It's very hard to be the first mover in that and to switch, and and you don't want to be the last mover. I mean, that's the nature of what the economics are. That would solve a lot of the issues. You'd immediately have Comcast saying, yeah, we're totally behind network neutrality. But because the market is the way it is, we are getting these distortions, and those distortions make hard cases. And so, personally, yeah, absolutely, it'd be great if the government stepped in and mandated that every ISP peered for free with CloudFlare. That would be awesome. You would all of a sudden cut out 50% of our costs. But that's just a distortion in the market that isn't necessarily what is the correct allocation of costs and burdens.
Right. So there's still the issue of where the cost shifts, and usage-based pricing. I don't know. That's going to be unpopular. Barbara, I would like to ask you. You wrote in the Atlantic this week about restarting the case for restarting the net neutrality debate. Maybe you can respond to also some of the things that Matthew just talked about, but. There are many people who say that there aren't enough examples of harms to really justify rules, and you kind of outlined several in your piece, and you have before. Can you talk a little bit about that? What you've seen, and Barbara, in one way, you're getting what you want. You're getting more rules, but you don't seem to be happy with them. Explain.
Okay, so the first question clearly is, when we think about network neutrality, I think the first thing we need to ask is, well, is there a problem? Because clearly we are imposing regulation on internet access provider, and we don't want to impose unnecessary regulations. So one of the first questions we need to answer is there a problem that we need to be concerned about? And Commissioner McDowell said, no, absolutely not, because we have had all of this innovation, but we have only gotten network neutrality rules in 2010. And I think that's the wrong way to look at this. Because since the Internet's inception, the Internet's architecture actually made sure that the Internet access provider could not interfere with what was going on their networks. And then in the mid-1990s, technology became available. We call this technology deep packet inspection, which allowed Internet service providers to block or discriminate or slow down applications on the network. And since then, we have heard concerns about blocking and discrimination. But since these very early days, the FCC has consistently said, while we are not adopting rules, we feel very strongly about the fact that users should have access to the applications of their choice. And if you don't live by these principles, we'll go after you. Chairman Powell did this in a famous speech at Silicon Flatirons in 2004. And 2 weeks later, when Madison River, a North Carolina phone company, was blocking Vonage, the internet telephony application, the FCC immediately went after them and stopped Madison River from doing that. Then in 2005, they adopted formal open internet principles, again saying, well, it's not formal regulation, but if you violate these principles, we go after you. So in 2007, when Comcast was found to be interfering with BitTorrent, the peer-to-peer file sharing application, the FCC immediately again stepped in, investigated, and slapped Comcast with an order that said, look, our open internet rule says you have to give people access to the applications of their choice and the content of your choice. You didn't do that, so we'll tell you to stop, and you need to find neutral, application-agnostic methods of managing your network. In addition, the FCC did lots of other stuff, adopt merger conditions, impose network neutrality conditions on certain spectrum. We had the broadband stimulus grant. And then in 2010, the FCC adopted the open internet rules. So everybody who's looking at the past 15 years and says, wow, in the US we had all of this regulation in the absence of network neutrality rules, isn't getting his facts right. The real facts are we had a de facto network neutrality regime, and the threat of more regulatory intervention kept the carriers on their feet. And we now have a dissertation from Alicia McDowell, who used to be the chief technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology, who, based on interviews with representatives of all the major carriers in the UK and in the US, can show how the threat of regulation affected the behavior of the carriers. So we can't look to the US to see what a world without network neutrality looks like. Where we really need to look is to a country where regulators said, you know what? You can block and discriminate as much as you like. We don't care because the market will fix the problem. And that's what the regulators in Europe did. In 2009, they always thought this is an American problem. The American market for internet services is so much more concentrated than the market in Europe. So in Europe, competition will just prevent carriers from interfering with applications and content. So in 2009, the European Union adopted rules that said, look, you can block and discriminate as much as you like, as long as you tell your consumers about it. So that's a world without network neutrality. And interestingly, it's exactly the world we live in right now after the court's decision. We have a disclosure rule, nothing else. So what happened? In the absence of network neutrality rules, we got widespread blocking and discrimination. And I won't walk you through all the examples here, because if I did that, it would take us at least 45 minutes. There are so many of them, and they are really interesting. So just give you a few snapshots. They fall into three categories. One, carriers interfered or blocked applications that increase in order to increase profits. Internet telephony is the prime example. From 2007 to 2009, all the wireless carriers in the UK, in France, and in Germany blocked and prohibited the use of internet telephony on their networks. In 2011, when the dominant wireline and wireless provider in the Netherlands, KPN, lost lots of money in text messaging revenue to WhatsApp, they held a press conference and said, this is unsustainable. We are losing all this money to these internet text messaging applications. So we'll adopt new tariffs, where on the basic internet service plan, you're not allowed to use text messaging applications. If you really want to use WhatsApp, you need to buy a so-called text messaging option. That means you pay, depending on the country, I don't know, I don't remember what exactly the KPN wanted to do. It might have been like $10 per month. So you pay $10 per month extra to KPN just for the right to use text messaging application. It doesn't go to WhatsApp, it goes to KPN. That created a massive uproar in the Netherlands, and they then were the first country to adopt network neutrality legislation. But these are not isolated incidents. There are lots of examples of carriers restricting peer-to-peer file sharing applications, tethering, text messaging applications, and internet telephony on wireless networks. We had lots of interesting content-based discrimination. A German carrier blocked the website of an entity that was criticizing its business practices and helping users, advocate for their rights towards that company. The ISP said, this is hurting our business interests, and just blocked access to the customers. In the UK, all the carriers, both wireline and wireless, have adopted content policies where by default, the network filters out content that's deemed to be harmful to children. That, you might worry or wonder about whether that's good or bad, but what happens is that this sweeps up lots of content that is actually not harmful to children. So the websites of churches, of small businesses, of GigaOM, of the equivalent of the Free Press have all been blocked as harmful to children in the UK. So content-based discrimination is the second category. And the third category is discriminatory network management. So in the UK, which is the country that we know most about due to Alyssa Cooper's PhD dissertation, most of the carriers have engaged in discriminatory network management. That basically means during peak time, from 5 p.m. to midnight, when everybody wants to use the internet, they impose restrictions on what you can do with your online connection. So they single out specific applications and treat them differently. So for example, BT in 2008 said, you know what, you might have bought the plan that allows you to use up to 8 megabits per second, but during peak time, we'll only let you use 768 kilobits per second for streaming video. So if your daughter wants to do online education and you want to watch the Game of Thrones, you couldn't be doing that.
Cecilia?
So yeah, please. I was just going to say, these are lots of examples. Rob, I'm sure you'd like to weigh in, and what do you think?
Well, first of all, I know we're running short on time because our time frame was 45 minutes, and I think we're starting to get over that time. And if what the professor says is true, this is something I've called for years, which let's have a bona fide, peer-reviewed market study that's put out for public comment that could be cross-examined. So let's have all these allegations come out. Let's find out what the evidence is. Let's see if there's systemic market failure, and go accordingly. The last time anything even resembling that was attempted was in 2007 by the Federal Trade Commission, and it was unanimous and bipartisan. The Federal Trade Commission said the broadband market was not broken, and it warned against new rules, a new body of law. And this is an important point, a new body of law that would be created that could create harmful unintended consequences we just can't foresee. So what we have in place right now is a lot of competition law. You have Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act. You have tortious interference with contract common law. You have all sorts of consumer protection law at the federal and state level for very complex industries. And that is also really part of the deterrent for ISPs to act in an anti-competitive way, in addition to economic incentives as well. But
so let me react to that, which is because you said that before.
Let's let Rob just finish up, and then we'll.
I didn't interrupt you, Professor. Thanks. So, there's a lot of bodies of law here, but when you create a new body of law, you're looking at the regulation litigation cycle, which can take years and create a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of competition law out there. The trial lawyers would have a field day if there were indeed widespread problems here. We'd also start to see market trends at the edge start to suffocate, which we're just simply not seeing. But if it's there, let's have that study, which proponents of net neutrality have resisted for years. So let's cut through the rhetoric, let's cut through the cherry picking, and let's actually look at it in an empirical way and have a fact-driven, database decision by policymakers.
So one thing, Rob, that several people asked about is whether, well, they just said, sort of asserted in comments on this Hangout, is there's just not enough competition. Would you agree with that? And Matthew Prince just talked a little bit about the choke points and the last mile as well, and the power that's there. So from where you're sitting, that's a big part of the discussion, is there enough competition to allow for this kind of the power that internet service providers potentially have as more people go to the internet? So I mean, do you think that this is a competitive enough market? And so yeah, I'll start with that.
Good question. So I think there are a lot of issues actually rolled into that, which is economic incentives, first of all. So ISPs really make their money off of selling more bandwidth. If you're a cable company, you're not making as much money off of reselling other people's video as you are off your broadband provision, your services there. So I think that's important for folks to understand that the fatter and faster the pipe, the more economic incentive there is for ISPs to build fatter and faster pipes if there's more demand, and they'll make more money as a result of that. The fastest growing segment of the broadband market is wireless broadband. Now, one could argue how competitive is that, but that is where consumers and eyeballs and ad dollars are going. Broadcasters are threatened and cable companies are threatened, and they're all responding accordingly. And I think that's very important to note. And also, I've been a long-time proponent of unlicensed use of the airwaves as well, such as the TV white spaces. That creates a competitive check and balance as well, and I think that helps keep things in check. So there's a lot going on, but another important point is the convergence of all of these companies. If I were to describe to you a company that has thousands of miles of fiber, servers and routers all over the country, or maybe the world, and offers voice, video, and data services, I could be describing Verizon, Microsoft, Google, or AT&T, or others. So the tech companies have to be careful what they wish for here, in that from an engineer's perspective, they start looking a lot like the so-called telecom companies that folks want to shift their costs to. And that is, potentially dangerous, as we've seen with their arguments in favor of empowering Section 706, which now could be used to regulate the entire internet ecosystem, apps and content as well, under the court's decision in January. So always be careful of saying, please regulate my rival, but not me, and that can come around to bite you.
So the FCC is really sort of in a legal kind of contortion act right now in many ways, and trying to figure out how to respond to the court order. Maybe each of you can briefly describe what is the ideal path forward, do you think, for this agency? And just briefly talk about it, and then we'll start with you, Matthew.
So I'm a recovering lawyer, and this conversation is reminding me of why I'm a recovering lawyer and not a lawyer anymore. What I'm somewhat troubled by is that the people that really understand the technology here aren't the ones that are helping make the decision on what should be done. The number of just factually incorrect things that I've heard on this conversation is fairly high, and that's hard because the technology here really does matter. And that's not really a criticism of anyone on this call or anyone in Washington. That's actually a criticism of technology companies that haven't made technologists available and have not participated in this process. And so I think it's actually incumbent, I'm sitting in San Francisco, I think it's incumbent on the technology industry to step up and talk about what is really going on here, because I don't think that the technical understanding to be trying to create regulatory rules here is understood, and the risk to technology companies is that if the story is largely being told by either the giant technology companies like Microsoft and Google, or the telecoms, that again, the risk here is that we shut down the ability to have new entrants and real innovation. And so, I'm not sure how to fix that problem, but I think the path forward has to be that if there are people who are listening to this that are frustrated with the conversation, the answer isn't to tune it out, but to instead tune it in. And we need hopefully the next panel will be not me, but a bunch of network engineers that talk about, here's actually what's going on in peering discussions. Here's what gets discussed at NANOG. Here's where there isn't enough competition. Here's where there is, and I would hope that the policymakers would take the time to reach out to those people who are not necessarily showing up in your office, because it's pretty easy to simplify this down to sound bites. But there's real technology here. There are real costs. Changes in policy will redistribute those costs, and in order to understand how that redistribution will happen, you have to understand how the technology works. And so my hope is that policymakers in the FCC will spend the time to educate themselves.
Okay, so Washington and Silicon Valley educating Washington a little bit more about what's really happening in the technology space and how it, in a real practical way, affects the companies and consumers. Barbara, what is your thought briefly on the best path forward?
So I think when Chairman Wheeler says he wants to protect the open internet and he wants to do it under Section 706, he's promising the impossible. So basically, it's impossible to adopt real, meaningful network neutrality rules under Section 706, because any rule that has real bite will run into the exact same issues that the open internet rules ran into, and then will be struck down in court. And so that's why we are seeing these sort of horrible rules coming out of the FCC, because they are trying to do the best they can under Section 706, and there isn't more that can be done. And I just want to point out really briefly, you were talking about commercial reasonableness. The court decisions actually limit how you can interpret that. And so under Section 706, for example, you have to allow companies under the commercial reasonableness standard to allow these fast lanes exclusively to one company and not to others, or to charge similar companies different prices for the same service. So even people who would generally allow these kinds of fees have always said they should be allowed in a non-discriminatory way. That's impossible under Section 706. So I think the answer ultimately is very clear. The only way to get real network neutrality rules is by reclassifying telecommunication internet services as a telecommunication service, and then adopting real network neutrality rules based on Title II of the Communications Act. And I just want to react really briefly to something that Commissioner McDowell said, because we have heard the same thing coming out of the FCC, which is, be careful what you wish for. You can't really do real network neutrality under Title II because Title II requires you to allow paid prioritization. That's not actually true. It's true that in telephony there are some precedents for allowing paid prioritization, but that doesn't necessarily mean these precedents also apply to the internet. There is a lot of precedents for the FCC banning certain practices under Title II. And so we would have to have, so basically my answer to that is Title II does not require banning paid prioritization, but it does allow it.
Okay.
But that's sort of a different debate. So what should the FCC do right now? I think the chairman has just acted really prematurely by saying, well, I'm going to do Section 706. I think the FCC right now needs to ask more questions to understand the space better. And I think the question should be, what are the kind of rules we need in the light of the evidence of discrimination and blocking and the problems from access fees? And then what is the legal basis for adopting these rules? And so I think they should adopt a notice of proposed rulemaking that just looks at all of the options. I think that's what a diligent lawmakers or regulators should do. Look at all of the options and then in the end make a decision.
All right, Barbara, thank you. So it seems like you agree with Jessica Rosenworcel, and it sounds like, Matthew, you're sort of echoing the same thoughts, that maybe what's on the table right now isn't quite baked in the way that people are happy with so far. But I will let...
If they can write an order, an NPRM within a week that asks the right questions, then maybe they want to do it now, because as Commissioner McDowell said, this is not the final rule. But if you don't ask the right questions, then you can't move forward. And so that's really something for the FCC to decide, whether they could write a better NPRM until next week, or whether they think they need more time to think through this and to think about how to structure the NPRM.
Okay, Rob, and your thoughts?
So that actually, with the professor, that last part is something I can find common ground with her on, which is asking the right questions is very important. And that's why I've said for years this could have been done a long time ago. We could have answered a lot of questions regarding a bona fide peer-reviewed market study that's put out for public comment, so that we could actually really understand what we're talking about. There's a lot of self-serving advocacy, you could say, on both sides regarding this. So let's cut through all the rhetoric, and this is a matter of good government. This is where you ought to start before you start making policies, really understand what you're doing. But it is a notice of proposed rulemaking. So in that, the chairman, and I don't agree that they need to do anything, because there are plenty of existing rules and law out there, as I've said before, but that if they're going to do it, open up to a lot of different questions and take in the public comment, and there might be plenty of ideas out there. But back to the point about Title II and sort of picking and choosing, by some estimates, Title II, again, created in 1934 and really drawn from the 1888 Interstate Commerce Act that regulated the railroad monopolies, and that goes back to the 17th century canal regulation, etc. So there's some very old concepts there, and the idea of natural monopolies, which operate completely differently from packet switch networks. But that, by some estimates, Title II has 100, I've heard as high as 1,000 different requirements. And for the FCC to start picking and choosing and saying which ones it's going to apply and which it's not going to apply really starts running into appellate problems. A court can look at that without substantial factual support as saying that's arbitrary and capricious. That's an appellate standard that gets you overturned.
All right.
Agencies. So, be very careful about that as well. What the FCC can and can't do under Title II, and how that might actually start spilling over into the content and application space. And by the way, international regulators would love for the FCC to do this so they can get their hooks into the entire internet ecosystem. It would give them tremendous cover.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining this hangout that was organized by the Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, who had to leave earlier for a vote for a very good reason. Lots more to discuss. Maybe we're going to see the vote postponed. Maybe that'll be the next news item. Matthew Prince, thank you so much. He's the CEO and co-founder of CloudFlare. He was one of 100 companies that signed a letter and sent to the FCC really cautioning about the idea of paid prioritization. Barbara Van Schewick, professor of law and electrical engineering and the director at Stanford, and the director of the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. She is a proponent of net neutrality. She's a proponent of reclassification. Robert McDowell, former commissioner of the FCC, just left in May 17, 2013. He says things are going pretty well as is and be very careful with the idea of reclassification. And Matthew Prince had the good idea of bringing more technology experts into this very legal conversation in Washington that I think could be a good piece of advice for everyone. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.